Welcome to the Korea Society's Arts and Culture program. With his 33 films, director Kim Gi-young is revered by critics and cinephiles within Korea and abroad as the first global South Korean auteur. As the first comprehensive scholarly volume on Kim Gi-young in English, ReFocus, the films of Kim Gi-young published by the University of Edinburgh Press, covers his entire career and cinematic work. To talk about Kim Gi-young's films and career, we are joined by four contributors to this new scholarly volume. Jason Besherbase is an academic and film critic based in Seoul. Steve Choi is an associate professor of critical studies in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. Ariel Schutzen is an independent film scholar and moving image archivist. And Chung-Gang Kim, who served as the editor of this volume, is associate professor in the Department of Theater and Film at Hanyang University in Seoul, Korea. Welcome to the Korea Society, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So to start with, for our viewers who are not entirely familiar with the Korean films of Kim Gi-young, Chung-Gang, would you provide a brief introduction?
Sure. So over the 30 years of his career, Kim Gi-young, who was born in 1919, produced and directed 32 feature films, which are widely regarded to be among the most sensual, grotesque, and provocative Korean cinematic works. Starting from making small documentary films during the Korean War, 29 of his productions were made before 1980, and so it could be said that his directorial output seriously declined after 1970. So his oeuvre covers the changing trajectories of modern Korean history, a path shaped by numerous layers of tumultuous historical experience, Japanese colonial occupation, Korean War, and 30 years of military dictatorship. The main body of Kim's work far exceeded the cultural and generic norm of the period, a legacy which renders him one of the most compelling directors in the history of South Korean cinema. So if I talk a little bit about a biography of Kim Gi-young was born into an upper middle class family in Seoul. When his father, a school teacher, was transferred to Pyongyang, he moved there and attended Pyongyang High School. There, Kim Gi-young showed great talents in modern art and culture. However, he did not immediately pursue a career in arts. Instead, he decided to become a doctor. He studied at Gyeongsang Dentist School for 2 years, and then he had a chance to go to Japan in the middle of the Asian Pacific War. After the liberation in 1945, Kim came back to Korea to pursue his medical career. However, the Korean War broke out in 1950, and this happened to be the cause for him to make film during the wartime. So during the Korean War, Kim began to make newsreels for the United States Information Service, that is USIS. And through USIS, Kim began his directorial career by making several small documentary film productions. Kim's early documentary films, such as I Am a Truck in 1954 and anti-communist narrative production, Boxes of Death in 1955, demonstrated the hybrid film combining various trends he had seen within international cinema. And perhaps Kim Gi-young's most renowned films are those of the Housemaid series, which were primarily produced during the repressive period of military rule of Park Chung-hee. This series consists of the productions The Housemaid in 1960, Woman of Fire in 1971 and 82, and Insect Woman in 1972, and Carnivorous Animal in 1984. The conventions of female and male iconography and the norm in many 1960s and 70s Korean films break down in these films. The unusual and transgressive nature of Kim's output also included representing people with physical disabilities and marginalized sexual desires, along with taboo subjects like pedicide, cannibalism, and necrophilia. His interest in such a theme intensified in later productions such as Eel Island in 1977, Soil 1978, Water Lady in 1979, and Numi in 1980. And in Kim's films that stray from this frequent interest, Kim shows his idiosyncratic aesthetic as well. For example, Kim portrays traditional Korean society in a grotesque rather than a sentimental or celebratory manner. This can be seen in films such as 고려장 that was made in 1963. And Kim's historical films, such as The Sea Knows, that was made in 1961, tragically represent the colonial past of Korea, but from his unbiased perspective on national history. So it deals with the love between Japanese women and Korean men. So in considering the career path Kim Ki-young negotiated across the political vicissitude of post-war South Korean society, a final significant aspect of his oeuvre is the relative independence he maintained in his filmmaking practice. So in this, in fact, compelled by his extremely limited access to mainstream financial resources and governmental restrictions. In sum, it could be stated that Kim's devotion to the sustenance of a long, consistent, and independent career can be considered as proof of his deserving status as the most distinctive global auteur to have emerged from South Korea during the pre-democratic period.
Thank you so much for that. So you just established that Kim Ki-young's work sort of transcends the conventional boundaries. How did Kim Ki-young sort of assert his agency and independence through his filmmaking during this time where, while he was working on the military dictatorship, where there was a lot of censorship, financial difficulties, restrictions? How did he do it?
Well, I think, there are several things that actually made his career work in that way during the really repressive period. But especially since, filmmaking needs a lot of money, and his wife, Kim Bong, was a dentist, and she was financially really supported the filmmaking of Kim Ki-young. So that is partially really helped, he could, to make him continue his filmmaking in a very independent way. But it does not mean that he was not struggled with the financial situation, because he tried to make like a national project films since he needed some money from the government. But while he was making this kind of propaganda film or the national project, he always tried to find a way to express his own kind of style and the themes he want to deal with. So so that is my answer for your question.
But in the 70s and 80s, there's a surprising amount of representations of sex in Korean cinema. So there's a couple of reasons for this. One is just the gradual kind of liberalization of the film market, and we can say a kind of Americanization. New Hollywood was coming in, and during these 2 decades, especially, the most successful films in Korea were coming from Hollywood, which after the decline of the production code, you have more representations of sex. So somehow this allowed for Korean filmmakers to do these so-called hostess melodramas, these kind of erotic films that were some of the best-selling movies in the 80s, as ways, especially in the 80s during Chun Doo-hwan's presidency, to kind of distract the public from politics happening during that time. So, these are very unusual films. These are very energetic movies by Kim Gi-young, but at the same time, there were changing representations of gender and sexuality, especially of, let's say, kind of sexually liberated women during this time. But still, it doesn't explain it completely, but in some sense, it explained the kind of extraordinary quality of and perhaps exciting quality of representations of gender in Kim Gi-young.
I mean, I think it's integral to note that his colleagues, the people he was making movies with when he was doing the USIS films, the people he were like Shin Sang-ok, people like that, they all went and were making like hundreds of films a year, and he was making very few. He had his wife to support him, and he was very particular about what he wanted to make. He was that person who was like, I have these ideas of what I'm going to make, and I'm going to work really hard to make sure that I'm going to get this movie made. I'm going to try and get someone to actually produce it. I'm going to try and get money behind it. But that was not necessarily what they wanted to fund. They didn't want to fund, his ideas as much in the times that they were, because, he wasn't a studio guy. He just wasn't a studio guy.
So you just used the usual adjectives that describe his films, sensual, grotesque, psychosexual, melodramatic, horror, to name just a few. So where do you think his style came from? What was his influences? What did he like to watch? Who were his idols? Where did he, during this time period where, we are so used to having everything that pops up on our phones and computers. Obviously, this is a very different time. He grew up during the Japanese occupation period, access to Western culture. I mean, film came from the West, so the access to American or European films were very limited. So who are his influences, and does anyone has any idea how he developed his very distinctive style?
When I started getting into Kim Gi-young, I started going back and looking at his theater influences, because I knew he was really, really into theater, and I knew he really liked Ibsen. So I started watching a lot of the Ibsen and reading a lot of the Ibsen that he had liked. So I know that, and then I went, oh, I can see a lot of parallels between some of the stuff that I was watching and reading. That there's definitely some there.
I can probably say that he's the first generation of cinephile in Korea. So he was really influenced by many Western and Japanese films, and he did like the strong woman characters. For example, he pointed out Morocco as one of his best films, and saying that Marlene Dietrich there, and strong characters like strong woman figures that impressed him quite a lot. And later, when he worked in the USIS, there was a library, and the library has a lot of films, not just the propaganda or documentary films, but it has many feature films too. So he could actually watch many films there. Of course, it's American films. But after, he had also a chance to go to Japan. So he went to Japan and watched many Japanese movies. And one of the films he produced, The Sea Knows, in 1961, that has a scene he watching the male character is sitting in the theater and watching Japanese like a samurai films. So he's really the one who was influenced by so many like a great directors of the world, and he's even influenced by many contemporaneous Japanese directors of the time, like 1950s and 60s. Japanese new wave film directors and so on. So yeah, that's what I can say about it. Yeah.
Then was his films commercially successful? How was he received by his contemporaries in Korea of the time in the 60s and 70s?
I know that financially, some from the work that I've done, financially, most of his films did not do well, and that made his wife, like, even though his wife was really supportive, she was like not that stoked because all of their money.
And that films are actually the 1970s films, because his films in 1970s and early 80s became really too extreme. So not many people really liked it. And for example, Your Island, that was only like streamed for 3 days, and the film was not screened. But The Housemaid was a big hit, huge hit.
Yeah.
And the Fire, Woman of Fire, that was also a huge hit, and Insect Woman also. So there are many like big hit films of Kim Gi-young, and he said that since he got a lot of money from these few like hits, and that was actually partially make him made more films later period. So he saved money from the financial success from that like a woman series, like the Housemaid series, and then he could continue for a while to make more films.
Yeah, I mean, during the 1960s, it's worth adding here, this is a so-called golden age of Korean cinema. It hit its peak in 1969. And I think, as Professor Kim mentioned, the Housemaid films, were very, very successful, especially the first one, which is one of the most successful films of that year. And I think he was a filmmaker, just going back to an earlier question that you asked. His films, certainly the Housemaid films, they're not really political in a sense that perhaps some of the other films were during that time. And so he's able to kind of not be restrained through censorship. He's not dealing with North Korean or North Korean characters, and so the motion picture law made it very, very difficult for filmmakers to work during the 60s, and particularly the 1970s. And that's, I suppose, later on, that's when he began to struggle to kind of strike a chord with audiences. But that wasn't just him. I mean, it was many other filmmakers as well, just finding it increasingly challenging to work in an industry where the government was making it, which was focusing on essentially controlling it rather than supporting it. And so I think that's one of the reasons that led to led to the difficulties for him to make films that were successful later on.
So in one of the chapters, it is briefly mentioned that the audience in cinema in the 1960s of Korea, the golden age that Jason just mentioned, the audience very much female. So a lot of people says that it was mostly women who went to see the films. I was wondering if somebody can expand a little bit on that idea and how that may have affected his films or the film industry in general at the time.
If you look at some of the films that were successful during that period, or actually just even before the 1960s, like Madam Freedom, for example, which follows this. This is not a Kim Ki-young film, but it's certainly, I think it's an example of a film that kind of focuses on female characters. The end of the film is somewhat depressing, but Certainly, you're seeing this kind of influx of Western culture and how these characters are influenced by Western culture. You actually see that in The Housemaid as well. And so it's not surprising to see female audiences go to the cinema in big numbers. And I think that reflected wider changes that were happening in society as America was having a bigger influence on Korean popular culture.
I mean, I think to go off of what Jason is saying, the woman's film and melodramas in general had a very, very strong place in 60s and 50s and 60s cinema in Korea. I think that you could name a bunch of them, to be honest. And that kind of that was a big draw for women. And I think so it's not, to me, it's not surprising that there was a huge female audience for Hanyul. And then they went, oh, wow, okay, I like this. I'm going to go see the next one that this person makes. That makes perfect sense to me.
So then let's talk a little bit about the women and men in Kim Gi-young's films. So Steve, your chapter is entitled Men, Women, and the Electric Household, Kim Gi-young's Housemaid Films. And as we've been just talking about, the Housemaid films are arguably his most well-known films and also commercially successful. Steve, I wanted to ask you, first of all, how were you introduced to Kim Gi-young's works, and what drew you to write this particular topic?
So of course I saw Housemaid. That was the first Kim Gi-young movie, and like a lot of people, I was just overwhelmed by and excited by this filmmaking, by this Korean filmmaking. It's so original and so energetic. And then I came to see Woman of Fire, Hwannyo, from 1971, and just kind of curious about this sequel idea. You know, I think that's the representation of gender in the Housemaid films gets to something that is very close to Kim's style and sensibility. These are not, let's say, kind of realistic men and women that you might see in other films of the 60s, especially where, you know, there's a maternal sense, for example, in the women. They're chaste until marriage. You know, there's the standards of femininity are pretty strong in other films, but these are women that are kind of hysterical at times and irrational. The men are not idealized, you know, patriots of South Korea. They're needy, they're impotent, you know, and all of these relationships are, we can maybe call them codependent, you know, dysfunctional. So I just found this to be so exciting. On the first step, I had to kind of let go of a expectation that film should kind of represent, let's say, models of ethical behavior or something. These are, I think, characters that are not to be necessarily identified with, but they're the form, the style, and the construction of gender is just so intense. And so, you know, when I came to watch his other, so the Woman of Fire 82, and then Insect Woman 72, and Carnivorous Animal from 84, I tried to think about, not necessarily about interpreting representations of gender in a kind of political sense, but more cinematically, and thinking about how he's moving from one film to the next, let's say, as a kind of resuscitation, let's say, from one film to the next, an intensification of certain preoccupations that he has. So we know that Hanyo, the story is based on a newspaper article that really kind of impressed him. And then the cinematic representation kind of exaggerates some of the facts of that newspaper article. And then each sequel exaggerates the previous representation in his own film. So there's, as Professor Kim has said, there's a kind of extreme quality to, as the films go on, and they track his general style and maybe his sensibility. So I thought that the way to think about this is not in terms of how do they accurately reflect ideas about gender and sexuality during 1961 or 1960, 1971, 1982, and so on, but to think about the energy and the life that he puts into these representations, that there's this sense of kind of exuberance, the sense of excitement, the sense of life, the sense of just production, hyper production. So historically, I was thinking about this in terms of the Park Chung-in, Jung Do-hwan presidencies and the demand, let's say, for the country to produce, to become an export-oriented economy. The valorization of work, the idea of the family directed towards, promoting the nation. So these films take that energy, the demand for patriotic labor, and make it excessive and make it absurd at times. So there's a kind of taking of this this notion of a productive Korean in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and pushing it to its limits through these representations. So it's, that's in a way just a kind of explanation that I've thought about, and it's very different than the kind of political or symptomatic readings that in film studies we're used to. Empowering characters or empowering relationships. I think there is something extremely thoughtful and even profound about his movies, but they don't provide a kind of direct reference to society at the time. They're more. There's something more. They're historical, but there's something more going on, and that more is cinematic and this kind of energy, this kind of life force that he imbues in these movies. So, yeah, I was so excited. It gave me energy to write and think about this, these films, and then to think about what is Kim Gi-young as an auteur. What is he thinking about? What is he going through?
So as you mentioned, women are a big theme, sort of the big theme, womanhood, should I say, is the big theme in many of his films. And a lot of people point out how multidimensional these women are, how they sort of break the mold of what the idea of an ideal Korean woman is, that they are very different. So what notions of womanhood do you think Kim wanted to embody in his films, and why?
Yeah, it's a kind of a great, question, because it's not clear, but we know that the women, when they, interact, especially certain kinds of women, like the housemaid character, who is, perhaps derived from the femme fatale character type from American film noir. But here again, the housemaid is more, the representation is more extreme somehow in Kim Gi-young. It's more, there's a kind of hallucinatory quality, especially as the films go on. As the films go on, they talk about procreation more. They are able to cite statistics about, how many babies are born in one day in Korea. Again, there's something about these women who are supposed to be like the producers, the laborers, the producers of babies, here, these representations take them to their kind of absurdist extreme in some cases. It's so fascinating and energetic to watch, but to locate a kind of reasoning, I think, can be difficult. I think this is a real central question in approaching Kim Gi-young, because it's very easy to say that these women are not model characters. They're not ethical or something, or they're, politically they're regressive in a way because they're so, the stereotype of hysterical women or something. I think that his film style invites us to try to read these representations in a way that goes behind or underneath, let's say, that kind of political understanding. There is something going on here, but it's personal to Kim, and maybe that can be kind of tracked from one film to the next.
It kind of reminds me of something that David Lynch said he said multiple times when people have asked about his films, and he's like, "What do they mean to you?" And I've read several times, Kim Ki-young has like responded to people asking about the films, and I wish I could pull the quote out about the women in his films, and they were never these, brilliant pieces of gold that were great. These responses, well, I created these women characters to mean this or to mean that, or to, there were never like an exact answer. They were kind of vague. And to me, that kind of points to what Steve is saying. I have a different take that definitely aligns with what Steve is saying, that it's definitely flipping the idea that these are hysterical women or that there's anything negative about them, because I've always seen these women in the film as extremely powerful and full of agency, and that's one of the things that has drawn me to the films, like hands down, bar none. Like that's why I'm a Kim Ki-young fan, because of many things, but that's one of the first things that drew me to it, is how much agency and power I felt the women had, and how complex those issues were, even amongst the women who were the bad guys. And you're like, wait, she's not supposed to be the good guy. She's supposed to be the woman who gets the person to cheat. But is she good? Is she bad? Where do we stand here? Is there such thing as good and bad? Do we actually, can we really ask these? Where do we stand where we ask these questions? Do those things exist? Do binaries, like, can we put a line down those things? So.
And your chapter, Ariel, is titled "To Speak and to Be Spoken For: Deafness, Stuttering, and the Woman in the Films of Kim Gi-young." And actually, you mentioned Yuh-Jung's acceptance speech at the Academy Award when she received the Best Supporting Actress, during which she thanked Kim Gi-young, who cast her in one of the films we were talking about, the Woman of Fire, correct? Why did you start with that speech, and what really drew actresses to him when he was asking them to play really these out of extraordinary, very difficult, quote unquote, abnormal characters? What made them be so brave and play these characters that were so different from what is considered as the ideal roles for upcoming actresses?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, those are two separate questions. The first one with my chapter is an easy one. The second one is much more complicated. The first one with the Academy Award thing was I tuned in, and all of a sudden there was a speech thanking my favorite filmmaker, and I was like, wow, this is pretty amazing. And I was stunned. And so that was, to me, there was something about it that said, that was in my mind, I was like, here's a bunch of Western ears who probably their only experience with Korean filmmakers at this point is Bong Joon and Park Chan-wook, and that's about it. And now they have another name of a filmmaker, and maybe they're going to go and seek out his work, maybe, but that's my wishful thinking. What made these women want to work with Kim Ki-young? That's a really good question. I mean, I think for many of them, it was they were pretty new actresses. I think that it was a challenge for them. These roles were very challenging. And from what I know, the challenge was worth it. And like many filmmakers who really bring out the best roles in their performers, it may have been difficult at times, which that's something that I have read, that it was not always easy, but the end result was basically a masterpiece. And we can definitely say that, I think, with the Housemaid trilogy. Yeah.
But speaking of rediscovering Kim Gi-young, Jason, your chapter is about that subject matter, the rise of the South Korean auteur on the film festival circuit. So I would love to hear from you how you discovered Kim Gi-young, and how people rediscover Kim Gi-young in the 1990s, as it was mentioned in both your chapter and Chong-gang's introduction.
Yes. So your first question, how did I encounter Kim Ki-young? It was through The Housemaid, like so many others. I knew Bong Joon-ho was a huge fan of his work, and so I wrote about Bong Joon-ho for my dissertation, and so I've been closely following his career. And he did a commentary for the DVD that came out years ago, and so yeah, I watched The Housemaid, and it's, as I was preparing my chapter, I'd seen many of his films before, but I kind of was rewatching some of them and actually watching some films I hadn't seen before. And I teach Korean cinema classes, so I screen The Housemaid to them every whenever I teach Korean cinema, and they sometimes go wild, and it's always an experience seeing my students watching The Housemaid for the first time. And so yeah, I guess that's my experience with Kim Ki-young, and I feel like it's an adventure. There's just so much to explore, and I feel like there's so much I haven't explored. So it's a bit like, you know, a treasure chest of, you know, just cinematic gold. As for the second question, Busan Film Festival, it had its first year in '96, and so it was one of the big, which is one of the big film festivals in Korea. You've got Jeonju, you've got Bucheon. These all emerged in the mid to late 1990s or early 2000s, as the film industry was growing, and the Busan Film Festival collaborated with the Korean Film Archive to put on these retrospectives. So the Busan Film Festival, like so many other festivals, focuses on discoveries. So these new filmmakers, we've seen a number of discoveries over recent years. I guess the most famous one recently is probably Kim Bora with House of Hummingbirds. But yeah, there is a whole number of them. There's Park Jong-bom as well with the Journalism Musan, and those quite a number of discoveries. But what they've done with the retrospectives is essentially kind of gone back in time and showcased work from established filmmakers, some of whom have been forgotten, including Kim Ki-young. So they showcased a number of his films, 8 of his films, in fact, in Busan of 1997, including The Housemaid, Insect Woman, Woman of Fire, among others. And although the local reaction to the films was pretty muted, the international reaction was pretty ecstatic. Chris Berry wrote a fascinating essay on the reaction to that retrospective, and others did too, and just talked about how they'd never encountered anything like it. And the thing is, before that, the focus on Korean directors was essentially new wave directors led by Park Kwang-soo, which, you know, not all of them kind of incorporated realism into their work, but a lot of them did. And that was also true for Im Kwon-taek, who was arguably the most famous Korean director at that time. And his films were certainly traveling on the festival circuit, you know, big festivals, including of course, Venice, where Kang So-yeon won the Best Actress award for The Surrogate Woman. But no one really encountered Kim Ki-young before, and he was just so different. There was full of excess, and I think his style was so distinctive, and he captured Korean culture and in such an innovative way, and that would certainly be a trait that many other Korean filmmakers that would come later and who would frequently be invited to festivals, including, of course, Park Chan-wook, who won his film Old Boy won the Grand Prix in 2004, and that was a big year for Korean cinema. You've got Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder, and Jang Jin-won's Save the Green Planet, and Kim Jun's A Tale of Two Sisters. And so these festival programmers were kind of discovering Korean cinema and these auteurs. But actually, Kim Ki-young came before that, and he had a whole body of work to kind of go through. And so then the Berlin Film Festival screened 4 of his films in February, early 1998. And unfortunately, tragically, he passed away literally 2 weeks before the Berlin Film Festival retrospective. Him and his wife were killed in a house fire. And it was completely shocking. It almost felt like one of his films. And so his films were being rediscovered literally a few months, or in Berlin's case, a couple of weeks. His death came a couple of weeks before that rediscovery. So for many people, so in Berlin at least. So yeah, it was really tragic. But I think it's interesting how his films were received before Park Chan-wook, Bong Joon-ho, Kim Jun, and others would perform so well on the festival circuit.
what was the legacy and what was the influence of Kim Gi-young on those who followed in his footsteps? The directors that you just mentioned, Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Kim Ji-woo, all of them sort of becoming an auteur themselves. What is his legacy, and what we talked about a lot of the stylistic uniqueness and differences of his films itself, but was there something else that sort of inspired these Korean directors who followed in his footsteps?
Yeah, well, Kim Ji-yoon, actually, there's a documentary on Kim Ki-young that's on, I think, the Housemaid Blu-ray, which is essential viewing, I think, for any fans of Kim Ki-young, directed by Kim Hong-jun, the director of the Korean Film Archive. And he said, Kim Ji-yoon said, he was interviewed along with many other filmmakers, which I think just captured how much of an influence Kim Ki-young has had on these directors. He said some of the cinematic DNA was passed on to the next generation. And so, yeah, I think thematically, I mean, certainly there are parallels between The Housemaid and Parasite. So looking at social class, focusing on these really quite eccentric characters. Certainly his visual, his style, you'll see that in the work of Park Chan-wook. So quite far removed from the realism that you see in the 1980s and 1990s, and before that as well, going right back to the 1960s, or even before that, from some of the earliest Korean films. And so, yeah, just kind of I guess the eccentric nature, the excessive nature, the conveying this Koreanness, which is what Chris Berry talks about in his essay, just in really kind of innovative ways. And it was interesting that in the UK, for example, a lot of Korean cinema was kind of certainly not all Korean films, but some Korean films, Korean titles, were labeled or marketed as Asia Extreme, which was a problematic label. But I think, films like Kim Ji-yoon's A Tale of Two Sisters, Park Chan-wook's Old Boy, which was the most successful film under that brand. I think it was as I was doing my research, looking at the reaction to Kim Ki-young, it shared some kind of similarities to what would come later with Old Boy, this grotesque film, or his very kind of explicit aesthetic. And so I think thematically there are definitely some, and stylistically, absolutely some similarities. In fact, actually, Bong Joon-ho, I'll just bring him up here, actually, because I've done so much work on his films, discussing his films. Bong Joon-ho's father worked with Kim Ki-young. So as I was doing my research, I discovered that the title sequence that in The Housemaid was actually designed by Bong Joon-ho's father. So there's a little bit of trivia there.
I do want to say, I wanted to pull this out here as we're talking about this particular topic. I think it might be a mistake to just kind of pigeonhole Kim Ki-young as just this with the grotesque and the extreme and the and all of the things that we're kind of throwing around also, because there's a lot of other films that he did that don't have that I think also influenced the same filmmakers we're talking about. And like films like The Sea Knows and like Promises of the Flesh and films like that. And I think it's these other films as in him as a total filmmaker. And it's, I remember one of the first blue discs I got was it's, cult filmmaker. And there's a part of me that like really cringes when someone refers to him as a cult filmmaker or horror filmmaker or extreme filmmaker, because there's so much beauty in like some of the stuff that he does, and it's slow, and and I don't know if that makes any sense, but I see similarities in the way that other filmmakers have done, like in Jin in The Wailing, like some of that, even though that's also horror, just the very slow, suspenseful work. And I don't know, I just wanted to bring that up too, that it's more than that.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with Ariel there. His work is he certainly has his distinctive sense of style and rhythm to his films, but certainly you can't pigeonhole into a certain category. He has a really wide-ranging body of work.
I just wanted to add one point. Even though it could be like even the films like The Sea and Nose or other like Koreojang and other type of films among like Kim Gi-young's film, it is not really similar to like a Housemaid series, but it does have kind of similar kind of like an excess style, like extreme style too. So I think that is kind of prevalent in his films and other things, but it is one other particular thing about his film is that there is always a character who is reading newspaper. So that shows, yeah, so the woman or man reading newspaper and consciously showing that, this film is not just about the certain kind of cult films that goes extreme, but he tried to like have a conversation with the society, like what's going on in the society, and try to, I don't know whether that is really neatly related, but there is always figures like trying to read the what's going on in that time. So one of the legacy, I think, the directors Park Chan-wook and Bong Joon, they are very conscious about this society. Like they are the like a 5, 8, 6 generations. They are always conscious about the Korean society, but stylistically, they do not really want to follow this like realism of films. But Kim Gi-young's like a consciousness about the society that could give them some more ideas how they deal with the genres and the styles with more kind of consciousness of the society. So that would be something I would like to add on.
I think that's wonderful. I mean, we know that Kim Gi-young, he was very, very well read, and so I imagine read the newspaper regularly. So wanted to perhaps think of himself as someone who could comment on society, not represent it, but to take something historical and turn it into a kind of cinematic experience, taking us beyond the reality of what is reported in the newspaper and imbuing it with a kind of aesthetic and intellectual energy, which maybe, according to him, is part of that reality, is underlying, like unconscious. He was extremely well read in Freud and Nietzsche and kind of Western thinking. So it may be that he's trying to comment on the ideologies or the desires or unexpressed anxieties that underpin drama that happens between Koreans at the time. But you can do that through the cinema. And so, this moving kind of starting with reality and stepping into the aesthetics of the image and the the way in which people like Bong and Park Chan-wook, Kim Ji-yoon, they're able to not simply reflect society, but also to kind of imbue it with a kind of aesthetics and a kind of affect that is intellectual, that is informed, but is reflective of, let's say, a Korean thinking person, someone who thinks within the language of cinema, like Park Chan-wook, for example, who's utilizing tricks and cuts and sequences that are purely cinematic. Sometimes, maybe too much so, but I can't help but to think that he was inspired by the wild and grotesque designs that are in Kim Gi-young, taking us beyond reality and into a kind of thinking about society through cinema.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, with what Steve was saying. Actually, looking at Kim Ki-young's use of style, he was very obsessive with just everything on set. And so I guess in that sense, he is similar to someone like Bong Joon-ho, who's known for his kind of, he wants to be this perfectionist. And so Kim Ki-young would learn lighting. He wanted to know everything that he needed to know to ensure that his films would be able to incorporate lighting in the way that he wanted and use it as a cinematic device. And so of course, he's got those around him that can advise him, but he wants to know everything he can. And that was true for the cinematography as well. I think he went to a photo shop and asked a professional photographer for lots of advice, and so yeah, he was obsessive when it came to detail, and he was a very good technician. So he was able to incorporate style in the way he did because he had the knowledge to do so. So it wasn't just that he's reading newspapers, he's well versed in Freud and and psychoanalysis and all the rest of it, and also clearly influenced by what a number of different films and filmmakers. But he understood how films were made, and he wanted to know how films were made, and so he wasn't reliant on a team to tell him. He wanted to be. He wanted to make sure that he understood the craft of filmmaking.
Oh, he was super hands-on. I mean, there's that story, I don't know if you know about the one where he was with his cinematographer, and he was, instead of the lenses that he had bottles the bottoms of soju bottles and soda bottles to put over the camera for colored lenses. Because the just to see if those bottles worked for colors better. Yeah, I love that. I love that one.
Maybe that's the definition of an auteur who is well-read, knows about psychology, yet knows everything about the technique as well.
Yeah.
What is the thing with the rats?
Yeah, they're creepy, aren't they? They're like the dirtiness that invades the home. And especially when they move into this two-story home with the stairs, the rats are there, and the housemaid goes there. The housemaid is a kind of foreign element to the family. But what's peculiar is that the rats were there already. They're not foreign. They're actually kind of domestic already. And so there's this sense that, even as this family is trying to raise their level of civilization, piano, getting a television, buying a new house, there's still this kind of contamination in the house, and it's always been there. In the face of citizens who are supposed to be hygienically clean,
physically, morally, everything, especially women, innocent, chaste, and all this. But there's this kind of it just shows that there's a kind of failure in that project of trying to create these hard distinctions between rats and humans, or civilization and uncivilized, or something, or tradition and modern. That there's always a kind of fluidity. It's like all these modern things in the house that suddenly can become deadly, like curry rice, or bottle of poison. All of these things are dangerous somehow. They're aligned with this rat. So in a lot of his movies, there's these animals, there's insects, there's non-human forms of life that kind of invade and infect in a way, but humans are animals, or humans are insects already, and anyway, just so rich and fascinating.
So you've all studied Kim Gi-young's Korean films for a while. I was wondering, was there anything that surprised you while working on your chapter, or while you're reading other people's chapters in this book?
I think I'm gonna just go with the same thing that we discussed the other night, which was I had originally wanted to concentrate solely on looking at the women characters and the women's characters' voices, especially since Promises of the Flesh has a women's voiceover. But then I realized that critical disability theory actually has a lot to do with a lot of the, there's a lot of parallels within that, and the stuttering characters and the deaf characters, and what I could do with, and how rich these women and their power plays within those films are. And that was very surprising to me, that there was such a depth of critical knowledge that I could work with, and it was so modern, and that these films really just are timeless.
I was surprised by his use of language. As the films go on, characters just declare things. They don't really interact with each other at times. Even though they're talking to each other, but they'll just declare things. And so they'll use the literary form of Korean, which is sometimes strange to hear spoken. Something da, something, they're declaring
ending with da, right?
Ending with da, yeah. And
yeah.
so who are they talking to? Why are these people talking like this? And sometimes what they say is just like, declaring kind of some vulgar things at times, like, women are nagging me, and that's why, I'm a destroyed man or something. And it's the ending is with the da, the literary form, the written form. So that was very surprising to me. And so as his films go on, I noticed that more and more. And there's just something. Who are they talking to? That was something that I haven't. Again, it's kind of exciting because no one has in Korean film does this, but then and it's also very Korean too, because it has to do with the language.
I was surprised to see we have like 8 chapters, and these all 8 chapters deals with the different topics, with different directions. So I found that this is fascinating. What is fascinating about Kim Gi-young's film, since his films can be interpreted in many different ways. So, and I think, there should be more interpretations should be taken for his film, because it's really not a simple films. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
And Jason?
Yeah, I mean, as I started my research, I was surprised, but I guess I shouldn't really be surprised that looking at the reaction to the retrospective in '97. So on the one hand, you've got the international kind of feverish reaction, and then the local reaction, which was just really kind of muted and subdued. And so, yeah, initially I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that before I went in and did my research. And then, looking at how that kind of predated, the auteurs. But just watching some of his films, I think, Ariel discussed this earlier, looking at female characters and agency. I thought as I watched more of his films, I would understand, maybe his thoughts on women and the representation in cinema. And actually, the more I watch, the more confused I become. I still need to see more of his films. I still haven't seen all of them. I mean, some of them are not available, but yeah, it's a really fascinating and almost bewildering experience, just following his characters and just looking at the betrayal of women in his films. I find it really, really surprising, especially for that time, for the 60s and 70s, just completely extraordinary. So yeah, that was one of the things I discovered.
Well, if Yuh-Jung's acceptance speech at the Academy Award did not entice people to watch Kim Gi-young's films, I hope this program definitely will, and also read the wonderful articles that were published in this volume, ReFocus, the films of Kim Gi-young. Thank you so much for joining us today and for this fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.